Hello, and good afternoon, everyone. So, over the last couple of days, we've heard about a lot of tools for strengthening, saving, fixing, rethinking democracy, right? We've talked about technology, about training, standards, about citizens' assemblies, citizen participation. So one tool we haven't talked about yet is money. And it's a big one. It's an important one. And it's the subject of this very provocative question today. Can money save democracy? And what I'm hoping to do with this panel, it's a little bit different, I think, from some of the other panels, which is I don't think the answer is going to come from the panelists. I think the answer is actually going to come from all of you, all the people who are actively engaged in this work. So the way I'd like to start with our panel, and we have you'll see they're doing really quite varied work, Nishant, Lalwani, Stefanos, Oikonomou, and Emily Thielmann. I'd like to start by asking each of you to describe the piece of the philanthropic world that you're involved in and the piece of democracy that you are sort of hoping to save or work with. Nishant, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Jyoti. And just hard act to follow that last panel. I like how they call us experienced people. That's not what my kids call me. So I am the CEO of the International Fund for Public Interest Media, and we are a multilateral fund that supports independent journalism in the Global South and Eastern Europe. And what we do is we provide financial support to newsrooms who are doing public interest reporting. We also look at long-term solutions to the massive financial crisis in journalism that you heard about during the Rethinking journalism.
And Nishant, can I ask you, and actually all of you, because I think when we start talking about billions and billions of dollars of philanthropic money, a bit of scale would be helpful here. So like, how much money are we talking about?
So we raised $60 million for our pilot phase. We've just
$60 million?
$60 million US dollars for our pilot phase. Most of that goes directly to newsrooms. We have just launched the next phase of our work where we're looking to raise $150 million over 3 years to support 300 further newsrooms. About 10 to 15% of that comes from philanthropy. But crucially, all of our early capital, when we were setting up the fund, and we wanted to do this fairly bold and ambitious thing of creating a global fund for journalism in the same way that you have Gavi or the Global Fund for TB, malaria, and AIDS. It's an ambitious idea. We wanted to give donors no say in which newsrooms were selected as grantees because we were, wanted to ensure that political and corporate influence was kept at bay. And so the first $2 million we raised was all from philanthropy, because philanthropy can actually take that kind of risk, right? It can take a long-term view. It can help create an institution that maybe can then put in place the safeguards, the board. Our board is now chaired by Mark Thompson, formerly of the New York Times, Maria Ressa, the decision-making structure, all of the policies around, transparency around how you make decisions, such that we could then raise another $40 or $50 million from public funds.
Okay. So we're going to get to some of those details soon, but let me move on to Stefanos.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much to the organizers for the invite. It's a really important conversation, and philanthropy really matters. So just by way of introduction, my name is Stefanos, and 3 months ago I founded Emergent, which is a mission-driven space for donors. And in case you're wondering where the name comes from, it is inspired by the words of science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who wrote, "There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And this, I felt, was important because Emergent Suns aims to inspire funders to work in radical ways. And radical does not mean extreme or fringe. Many funders understand radical as in taking on the root causes that produce the problems that we're trying to solve further downstream with funding. Radical means centering relationships and people and lived experience and reimagining the structures that generate injustice. So it's thinking beyond philanthropy as charity from a place of solidarity and transformation.
And again, if I can ask you to give us some scale and like where you're working.
And I think that's, it's an important question because I was not able to answer it yesterday when we talked about it, because I started my new venture 3 months ago, but I've worked for 80 years with one of the largest infrastructure organizations in Europe, representing 200 funders. And we cannot get to this question in terms of how much philanthropic funding foundations are contributing out there, because of course there is no single market for philanthropy in Europe. Foundations come in very different shapes and forms, governed by different regulatory frameworks. So it's not an easy answer because of this fragmented landscape. But something that I feel is important also to bring here at this stage is the clarity about what we mean by philanthropy, because philanthropy has many expressions. We can talk about individual donors, we can talk about mutual aid groups, donor circles. I refer from this experience with institutional philanthropy, so organizations that are having their own resources, they have independent governance that deploy for public good. And I think it's important also to expand our understanding of philanthropy beyond money, because foundations have other assets and levers. Foundations have their endowments, foundations have their voice and how they speak and help society understand certain issues. They have convening prowess. They sit in a vantage point in a broader ecosystem so they can connect different actors. So we need to understand and bring all these levers into account, because that's also where the tension lies in the question. It's not just funding that comes with power, that individuals perhaps should exercise with caution, is how they deploy all these other levers when they speak with financial elites, with social elites. So all are these ways that could potentially, but not deterministically, could contribute to exacerbating some of the tensions. But I want to highlight that from the experience of working with foundations in Europe, this is a sector that is part of civil society, is doing critical work in defending civic space, supporting grassroots movements, and this matters at this context. So we need to have very nuanced discussions about wealth, power, privilege, associated practices that can help work with some of these tensions, but keep in mind that the focus will be on strengthening and raising the bar for the sector, and not necessarily painting a negative picture because of some examples that we might have when we think about wealth and foundations in other geographies.
Okay, we're going to talk about all those tough questions soon. But Emily, you work primarily in the United States. That world is a little bit better defined, but tell us exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, so Democracy Funders Network is a cross-ideological learning and action community for around 600 funders who are concerned about the health of American democracy. While our work is focused on the United States, we really believe that it's critical to situate what's happening to democracy in the US in a historical and a global context. For scale, we have around 600 donors, as I mentioned, and we're a combination of individuals, donor advisors, and institutions. In the United States, around 67 to 70, depending on how you measure it, % of giving is coming from individuals, which presents an incredible opportunity when you think about trying to drive more resources to the democracy space. Democracy Funders Network also was founded around a couple of pitfalls that we saw in the philanthropic ecosystem for democracy in the United States. The first is that we really strive to disentangle preferred policy and political outcomes from democracy. Because a lot of pro-democracy in the United States lives de facto on the left, these things are often conflated. And it's critical to make sure, one of the things that's happening is the term and concept of democracy is becoming politicized and contentious, which is very dangerous. So we need to build a broad ideological coalition. We need a democracy agenda that all Americans can commit to, regardless of political, religious, racial, or ethnic backgrounds. We also are organized around the principle that there's no one silver bullet that by itself will solve the challenges to our democracy. We need many different lanes of investment at the same time. And in the United States, there's a strong gravitational pull for democracy funders around voting and elections. And part of our charge is to remind them that there's other things to do, like combating hate and violence, thinking about healthy information ecosystems, building civic education, and on and on and on.
Right. So I want to dig in here, Emily, because obviously we have the U.S. election coming up. There's not only a lot of interest in that election, but the field of funding democracy, like there really has been an explosion in interest among, let's be frank, among wealthy people, people who have millions of dollars to give, suddenly realizing like, oh, this is somewhere that I can use my money. Do you is there a way of quantifying like how much philanthropic giving is going to that, and how are you channeling that energy? And you use the very polite term preferred outcome, but I would love you to sort of dig into that a little bit. Like those, I'm assuming those are some tough conversations to have with people, with institutions who may be feeling like, listen, we have a candidate who's a threat to democracy. The way to deal with that threat is to defeat that candidate, but that is not what you're talking about. So can you dig in a little bit?
Yeah, there were a couple threads to your question. Where do you want me to go?
Why don't we start with the quantifying? Like how big is the interest? How much money is pouring in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually there's an amount in the description of the session, so I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I will say that, I mean, there's billions and billions of dollars here, and we are blessed in the United States with a very robust civil society that's doing a lot of critical work to hold the powerful accountable when they're violating democratic norms and practices, to build healthier democratic practices, and it's largely fueled by philanthropy. So the way that I kind of feel about it in this moment is the stakes are very high in the United States. And we need all the resources that we can have on the table to make sure not just that we have the robust, thriving liberal democracy that we want in 50 or 100 years, but frankly to make sure that we have one in 2 years. And philanthropy also has a critical role to play around experimentation. I think one of the, so there's overall numbers, but one of the things we're trying to get more sophisticated at understanding is where within this very burgeoning ecosystem money is flowing. And one thing we just did to that end is we launched a database with Impala. It's called the U.S. Democracy Hub. It's a free to use resource for those that are working in or interested in the United States. And we've basically classed the field into 9 different ecosystems. So everything from healthy information to empowered electorate, to work that's more focused on social cohesion, combating authoritarianism. And you can look there to see it's historical in nature. So right now it just goes to 2022, but you can see how much money is flowing within each of these spaces. And I just looked this morning to refresh my memory, and one of the interesting things is there's an ecosystem around grassroots organizing towards opportunity and justice, and that's where most of the money is going. So I think sometimes when I compare notes with funders in Europe, there's much less tendency in the United States to support the health of institutions, which seems to be, I think, more popular here, and much more tendency to fund advocacy and political strategies. And there's really a lot of that happening in the philanthropic space. And you need both, but it's about balance, too.
So Stefanos and Nishant, you both sort of mentioned the potential for philanthropy to kind of expand the time horizon, right? Like that thing that philanthropy can do better than some other tools, because you're not necessarily looking for an immediate outcome. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're taking advantage of that?
It's an important question because, again, going back to the unique role that foundations can play, foundations are not burdened by, they do not have, like politicians, a 4-year or even shorter electoral cycle. Or like in business, there is not it's not you don't need to report on profits every quarter. So what in principle, there should be nothing holding foundations back from taking a very long view in terms of how they fund, they operate in these spaces. But in practice, it's more complex, and I think one of the reasons for that is because there is this horrible disease in the social space, a disease called projectitis. How many of you have heard of this disease? So this is like a trap that many funders and nonprofits find themselves in, that the ambitions of their mission and their work is to affect change at systems level, affect change when it comes to narrative, to building power among civil society. Yet the time horizons for funding are 1- and 3-year time horizons, and funding is organized, takes the shape of a project grant, which I haven't heard many examples of organizations moving the needle when they try to do this long-term systemic work. Of course, if you're funding services or if you're doing work that cause and effect is relatively established, the relationship between cause and effect and control over outcomes, maybe. But when we talk about this space, there is a need for foundations to think beyond the grant. There is significant movement in the sector towards flexible funding to understand that projects do not exist in a vacuum, but require strong organizations and civil society. It means not just funding long-term and with multi-year unrestricted funding that also allows organizations to seize on the opportunities. When we talk about closing space for civil society, when we talk about defending democracy, these are dynamic, adaptive environments. You don't want to have an organization on the front lines being trapped in a series of activities that are predetermined. So I think going beyond the grant, think about funding organizations, funding long-term, and the other very important thing is funding through costs. Because in order to have organizations succeeding in this work, they require HR to take care of the well-being of people. They require strategy retreats. They require infrastructure so that funders really need to pay what it takes. And now I'm speaking of funders, not just foundations, but public funders, other institutions, to understand, to look into the how of their funding and how it's so intrinsically linked to bringing, to generating the impact that they want to see.
And to be fair, I mean, there's a reason why philanthropy moved in that direction because of an effort to kind of make sure that the money that was going in was actually effective, that it was, affecting outcomes in some meaningful way. But what I'm hearing you saying is that the kind of change that democracy needs just doesn't lend itself to that. I mean, Nishant, I'm sure you see some of that same tension, that same pressure. Like, how are you dealing with that for funders involved in media? Yeah,
I think the key is that we have to be relentlessly focused on the needs of the communities we serve. And, with philanthropy, especially philanthropy with living benefactors, there's always a temptation that needs to be focused on the interests of the actors who are making decisions and not the needs of the benefactors, of the communities that are being served. So, a truly decolonized approach to philanthropy starts with who are you trying to serve, what are their needs, and then who are the right people to make those decisions. It may not be the program officers of the aid agencies or the philanthropies. Especially when it comes to journalism, which is what we focus on, you need to be as close to the political context you're working in. I mean, journalism is different in each country. The information needs are different in each country. For example, our largest national program is in Palestine, where we'll be funding 20 media organizations in the West Bank and Gaza this year. And, we've set up a committee of local experts with very strong Palestinian representation to choose those 20 organizations that they feel can best represent Palestinian voices right now, which are obviously crucial to represent given the international dialogue and given the abuses of power that are happening in the region. And so, all of our regional directors are of those regions in our regions, and they're trying to make decisions about who to support based on audience research and based on the information needs that they can see in their countries.
Okay, so my question for you, Nishant, is if you're speaking to a billionaire or someone like that who can just buy a media organization, and many of them do in the United States and elsewhere. Like, how do you make the case to someone like that, instead of just buying your own, I want you to invest in this fund that will, support lots of different media organizations. Oh, and by the way, you don't get a say in what any of them publish. Like, how do you make that case?
It's governance, really. It's selling, rightly selling the arm's length relationship that donors have with media organizations as a feature and not as a bug. So, for many donors, and not just billionaires, but for many donors, being directly linked to media outlets, especially if they're foreign media outlets, can be highly sensitive, deeply political. It's quite risky. And there are many foundations that have had a lot of pushback in Eastern Europe and other places for coming in and supporting media. I would argue a lot of that support's been vital, and without that, we would be in a much worse place. But if you can say that decisions are being made by this team of locally placed experts, with a board of esteemed journalists, with a governance structure where donors don't have a say in which grantees are chosen, let alone editorial influence in the newsrooms, then I think that's actually best for donors, because they're not then exposed to that kind of political risk. I think if donors, if billionaires want to own newsrooms, that's absolutely within their rights. And I think they, obviously have to be careful about editorial influence. But I think, that's with The Intercept or The Washington Post or others. I think, that model, especially in the US, is now happening more and more, I think.
Emily, what's the case that you're making? It looks like you want to jump in.
Well, yeah, I just want to add one point, and I think there's been some interesting forcing mechanisms in U.S. philanthropy recently to give up a little bit of control, and some of it is about the situation that we're in. For example, there's a lot of planning related to election-related crises. Like, it happened in 2020, it's happening again now. We don't know what will happen. It's pretty inevitable that there will be some sorts of crises. Political violence, hopefully not, attempts to subvert the results of the election. And there's a pooled fund called the Trusted Elections Fund that was stood up so donors could put their money into a mechanism that was able to rapidly deploy funds much more quickly in response to crises, recognizing that not every foundation can just turn around and see what's happening on the ground and move money in that direction. There's also a really nice success story this year, because a lot of election-related funding tends to move right before the election, when everyone gets nervous, which is actually not when it's useful, because even if we're talking about non-political funding, just getting people out to vote and things like that, you need to hire people, you need to train them, it takes time, you can't just do it overnight. And there was a campaign started by a funder called the Democracy Fund in the US called All by April, that told all the funders to get their resources all out the door by the end of April. And people did. And the interesting thing is that I've had conversations with a number of funders in recent weeks where they're feeling a little bit futile because they gave away all their resources and there's still a lot of things happening. But we had some conversations early on when this campaign was being designed, and basically the choice was, do you want the rapid response decision-making to sit with the funders, or do you want it to sit with the organizations who are closest to the problems? And that's where it is right now. And so could there be more resourcing? Absolutely, but it's an interesting cultural pivot for the field.
Yeah, it's when you say pooled, what you're really talking about is a kind of collaboration that is so important and I think is not always visible to people outside the world of philanthropy. Stefanos, I know you've talked about this as well. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential for collaboration in philanthropy?
Yeah. Indeed, there is great potential in collaboration, understanding that collaboration is a spectrum, and it starts with simple things like exchanging information and then moving further along to other activities like co-funding. And in this particular area, I think it's important because in Europe, it would be, I feel like from the experience with the foundations I've worked, it would be highly unlikely to see foundations engaged in electoral processes. That's not considered a space where foundations are must help in terms of mobilizing voters or election integrity. But what is changing is issues get politicized, and there is the understanding that we don't just need technical solutions to engineer like the transition to net zero side, we need political will as well. And there is, of course, a lot of fear there among funders that if we are to advocate for policies or contribute to public discussions about things that touch on policies, that starts becoming very risky because there is a risk of getting caught in a partisan fray. But there is also in the context of smaller family philanthropies, again, it's important to remember that most foundations in Europe are local foundations, are small family foundations that derive their legitimacy by being embedded in this local context. And there is a fear of individuals that they're going to find themselves getting vilified. We saw some examples. We saw an example in Hungary, not of a small foundation, but of a big foundation getting caught in politics and then having to leave the country. So collaboration, not just in terms of from an efficiency point of view, but in terms of empowering funders to be more bold, discuss and wrestle with these tensions that come with advocating for policies and defend the common good is extremely important. And one more layer maybe I wanted to bring in is that when funders influence other funders, and funders speak to other funders, so it is very important to create opportunities for exchange and collaboration, because that helps shift also the Overton window in terms of what is really impact here? How do we understand impact? Is it our impact? Is it the impact of the grantee partners? There are calls for funders in the name of accountability to attribute impact to their specific funding, which can be very dangerous to collaborations if you start making claims that it is your funding in the context of collaborative work that move the needle. And we see also a shift there in Europe, that instead of talking about impact in narrow terms, there is this more expansive understanding of impact, and that it takes collaborative approaches, and it is more, especially in interventions, in complex dynamic environments where there are multiple pathways to change, that the focus should be on learning and adaptation, learning also about our organizations and are we being helpful, how can we reduce barriers? So there are all these things that are operating at the same time.
So Nishant, I mean, the way your work is structured, it really is, it's all about collaboration. Is that a selling point? Like, how are you talking to your donors about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main rationale which resonates is that if you look at the overall picture for democracy and for journalism, we're pretty screwed, right? I mean, over the last 10 years, if you look at VDEM data, we've gone from 46% to 71% of the world's population living under autocratic rule. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, we've got 8% of the world's population living in full free democracies. Just 0.2% of all foreign aid goes to actually supporting journalism and media. That's $500 million a year. Right? And to compare, Russia's propaganda budget every year is about 1.5 billion. So frankly, unless we have collective action, there's no way we can make a dent in this. China spent about $7 billion in the last 10 years on buying up media outside its own borders in Africa and Latin America. We're spending, as all 33 OECD countries are spending $500 million a year. I mean, so even if we act collectively, even that's not enough. We need to do more, and we need to act collectively around the shared values of informed citizens, individual agency, holding power to account, and election integrity to actually make a dent in this problem. It is not trending in the right way.
Yeah, yeah. I know you in your introduction, you used the analogy of the Global Fund to fight TB, AIDS, and malaria. And that, to me, was kind of like, whoa, that was a really startling way to think about the problem of supporting journalism as a means of supporting democracy. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it's not the first comparison I would have come up with.
Yeah, I mean, we are suffering a market failure here for the public good of independent journalism, right? Especially in low and middle income countries. And also, as Steve and others were saying yesterday, in local news in the US and in many pockets of the world, we are suffering this market failure. And, you know, UNESCO have said, you know, public interest journalism is a public good. And so what happens in other sectors when you have a market failure for something that's too important for your society? You have states step in, you have philanthropy step in, as the Gates Foundation have done, for example, with the WHO and the Global Fund, and you try and repair that market failure. You also make sure that millions or billions of people are not suffering unduly because of that market failure. And we saw this with Gavi and COVAX during COVID as well. And yet, journalism, which everyone agrees, I'm sure in this room, but even more broadly, is crucial, is getting very, very little support. Not just from foreign aid, the states I mentioned, but even philanthropy. Just 6.2% of all philanthropy in the information integrity space is spent in the global south, right? 83% is spent in the US. So really, journalism is not getting enough recognition as a public good. And of course, that's because historically it's been profitable. But that's changed, right? Global ad revenue for newspapers gone down by 2/3 in the last 5 years. Sorry, in the last 10 years. Half in the last 5 years. So, the dot-com boom was a long time ago, and we need to start acknowledging that if we want this public good to survive and to evolve, if we want to invest in ensuring that AI is a boon and not and doesn't undermine public interest journalism, we need to invest a lot more money in it.
So now one of the reasons why the Global Fund analogy works, though, is because philanthropy can address a market failure when you're not looking for new technology to fix this problem. We know how to do journalism, right? Like it's a sort of known intervention, the same way that with TB and malaria, less so AIDS, but certainly now with AIDS. Like the interventions that you need. It's a matter of kind of addressing the market failure. But with democracy, it's not only about the known solutions. Philanthropy, from understanding your work, can also foster experimentation, innovation. And I would love to have you guys sort of talk about the ways that you've seen that. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think so we have quite a bit of clarity about the problems, but we don't necessarily deeply understand the problems, and this is what makes them complex. And even, like, to give an example of the space in the US to reduce toxic polarization, which is an enormous issue that's causing all sorts of other issues, there's a lot of turmoil about what works in that space. There's been an explosion of organizations that do bridging work, and there were just a couple pieces that came out in the last week that was basically calling into question the efficacy of a lot of these really popular programs, and that continues to come up. I saw another piece by Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld recently that was drawing people's attention back just to social contact theory, which is like getting people to work together as equals on a shared goal, towards a shared goal, like very simple tenets. That actually does have some research basis behind it. So there's a lot of open questions about what works. And one of the things that I think is interesting in the United States is because we have 50 states, we essentially have 50 little mini learning laboratories. And if anyone heard Rob Ritchie last night talking about ranked choice voting, like there are some voting-related reforms that can be tried at the state level that would never be tried nationally in the same way, but we can learn, like, this works in this particular context and then try something and scale it. And so there's an incredible need for experimentation, and a lot of our charge as a learning and action community is to help funders. It's okay to have focus, but you need to be attuned to the broader ecosystem in which you're sitting and to be asking these critical questions and to be questioning your assumptions about what is most effective.
And what's the role of philanthropy there? Is it to actually fund like an experiment with ranked choice voting or the research?
Philanthropy will come in and fund the pilots and the tests. I mean, again, this is mostly nonprofit organizations doing this work, but they are fueled by philanthropy. to give another example, I'm working with a group of funders in the United States that's interested in doing more pilots around citizens' assemblies, which I know are very popular here. They're mostly unheard of in the United States, with a few exceptions, but there is growing momentum to pilot and test, and in this case, it's like, we might know what works in Europe, but the US is a very different context, and what works in Oregon might not work in rural Texas, and so there's just this constant need for iteration and experimentation.
Stefanos, are you seeing some of this experimentation?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the experimentation also is linked to the unique value of philanthropy, that other than just being catalytic in terms of crowding in other forms of funding, because philanthropic funding in and of itself is not enough to solve alone and should not even try, as we've discussed, to solve some of those issues. But there is value, again, in this demonstrative leverage, to put it this way, that foundations come and act as the risk capital of society to show a different way of thinking or a different way of acting on a problem, expecting that other actors might come into scale. There is also the conceptual leverage we should talk about, and Emily touched on that in the sense that we need to question the assumptions also. And I've heard many foundations also in thinking about their work, and especially in context when we see closing space for civil society. What did we get wrong? What did we leave out of our initial conceptualization and analysis of the problem? Is it, why, if these blind spots existed, why is that? Is it because people with lived experience missed, or is it that we subscribed to a certain ideology that ruled out a set of other options? But I think, again, talking about citizen assemblies, for example, it is, sometimes there is the default setting of looking into funding familiarity and what already fits, what exists already in a grant-making portfolio, the typical nonprofit. But some of the solutions will come from citizen assemblies, from community land trusts that help reimagine property in a different way, will come from data trust, types of organizations that do not look like the familiar nonprofit that falls in a box that will sail through a due diligence process. So foundations need to spend also, I think, more time on this, like how do we understand and engage different types of organizations, because innovation will not look familiar in many examples.
So you mentioned the closing space for civil society, which I know is a topic of a lot of concern in many places, like certainly in Asia, in Europe. It's starting to become a bigger concern in the US too. I mean, Emily, are you seeing people kind of observing what's happening in other countries and being more attuned to the possibility?
Yeah, and I would say it's a little more than observing what's happening in other countries, because we are starting to see closing civic space in the United States, and it could get a lot worse. And so there's a lot of funder attention to this, a lot of civil society attention, and the phrasing we've been using recently is like, how can we make sure that people are able to stay safe and effective? So first, safe from physical threats, from cyber threats, from just the fear of acting in the public sphere, and able to continue to do their work. And there's a lot happening there to make sure that this robust ecosystem of the pro-democracy movement can continue to operate.
Nishant?
I think part of the reason why this is happening all over the world is because we've essentially outsourced the rules of public debate to tech platforms. And even the rules of electioneering to tech platforms. Certainly that was happening 2016 and 2020. And now the EU and various other regulators have started to wake up to this. I think some of the more interesting work happening in philanthropy right now, which some states can't do, is efforts to regulate tech platforms. Because Luminate, Reset, and other foundations are actually looking to see what rules should be for algorithmic transparency, what rules should be for countering hate speech online. We saw the effects of hate speech in Myanmar, for example, and in many other, our board chair Maria Ressa has been subject to a great deal of online abuse via Facebook. So I think there's a shifting tide to realize how the tech platforms have had a massive impact on debate, on the public square, on closing civil space. And we have to ensure that that changes if we're going to reopen that space in the future.
So I wanted to also, again, in the spirit of kind of challenging all of you, we talked a little bit yesterday, Stefanos, about the example that I think perhaps at this point the philanthropic world has observed what's gone on in the conservative, not just conservative media, but conservative philanthropy, really, like the way that they have used that long-term time horizon to kind of affect political space. I mean, some of them define the work that they are doing as preserving democracy, open, keeping open civic space in a certain way. Like, what are the lessons that you feel the world of philanthropy has drawn from that experience?
Really important question. And again, I think within the European context, we might not be using terms as conservative philanthropy or liberal philanthropy because there are such binaries, perhaps, such binaries that don't exist in foundations, again, understand their role differently. I think lessons learned from the experience you're describing is, again, the importance of funding people, funding ideas, funding long-term without any strings attached because change takes time. I think this is, this stands out, but again, we don't want to be in a situation that private individuals battle it out, or I don't want the message to be that there needs to be a counter force to that example.
You're a billionaire, my billionaire.
So there is a need, and again, in Europe, we see that there is very strong understanding in terms of what are appropriate roles for funders, what is public, what is private, self-regulation that we see from foundations, leading the way in terms of asking, setting, drawing the lines in terms of what is okay, what is not okay, because in the end, it should not be about individual actors deciding and having so much power over democracy. And I think one last point that I wanted to bring is, I think it ties into the question, is the point of power and privilege, because there is, again, this recognition that democracy is eroding. The world is on fire. We're crossing planetary boundaries. Inequalities are increasing. And the far right is marching in Europe and is completely normalized. So if anyone is not feeling the fires of these flames, it's because privilege protects them. And there are some structures that protect people from that privilege, from the reality of facing the fires. So I think the one message that, again, it's not an indictment, but a call for heightened responsibility is to act courageously in ways that are commensurate with the challenges that we face, and really make sure that we fund as if the world depends on it, because it does.
Well said.
So before we open it up to questions, and I know we have lots of experts in the room who will have questions, I was hoping to just ask each of you to leave the audience with either an answer to this question or a way to think about it or a provocation of your own. Can money save democracy? Emily, do you want to start?
I'll just respond to one point Nishant made and one point Stefanos made. So I think Nishant was talking about the limited funding to the information ecosystem field. And overall, really, I feel like that's true. And nothing is as resourced as it needs to be. There's both a need to be more strategic in this space, but also a tremendous opportunity to bring more donors into caring about democracy. And one of my favorite types of funders to work with in the US is the funders that come in because they care about other issue areas. They say, I'm a health funder or I'm a climate funder, and I realize that I can't actually do any of my work if the whole democratic platform through which we make policy and decisions is broken. And I think there's a really powerful case to be made there, and that's probably a transferable point beyond the United States. And then in what Stefanos was saying about putting out fires, I think that we're trying to hold right now both the doom and gloom putting out fires, which needs to happen, unfortunately, and the need for joy in combating authoritarianism. Like Ruth Ben-Ghiat has written about this, and it's coming up in the Kamala Harris campaign, but there is a role for imagining better futures for democracy that we really want to be aspiring towards, instead of just always having these conversations about the doom and gloom. And I'll harken back to the youth panel. It's like, don't want to read the newspaper because it's depressing. Like, it's true, and that's not what motivates people in the end. So there's really a strategic value in thinking about that motivational future that we're actually striving for, instead of what we're just running away from.
That's great. Nishant, what any closing, something you'd like to leave the audience with?
Sure. A lot of funders and actors find it difficult to support democracy. They don't know really where to start. And I would say that start with journalism, and preferably our fund.
Right.
And I say that not purely selfishly, but I say it because an investment in journalism is an investment in fighting climate disinformation. It's an investment done right in giving young people a voice. It's an investment in election integrity. And it's an investment in creating the right kind of social fabric and representing our citizens. So, I would call, like, as I said, money isn't increasing in this space. Can money save democracy? No, but we can't save it without money. So journalism is a great place to start.
Stefanos, what's your answer? I know you've been very thoughtful about the caveats, but what's your answer to this question?
So I think we'll need to rephrase the question. So instead of asking, can money save democracy, is how do we empower philanthropic assets beyond money in a holistic way, work with other sectors to affect long-term solutions and plural strategies, not, again, one size fits all. It's not a silver bullet. We're looking into very complex things. So uplifting examples on collaboration that Emily mentioned, and the need, again, for a plurality of approaches and not looking for something, a single point solution in a complex system, are things I take away from Emily and Nishant. So let's rephrase the question maybe and continue the discussion.
Okay, so why don't we, start here. We've got questions in the back. I don't know where the mic is. All right, here we go.
Thank you. This is a question for Nishant. I think the initiative of the International Fund for Public Interest Media is incredibly important. The question I have is, how are you going to ensure against state capture around your investments in these markets, where often there are bad political actors?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're seeing a huge amount of state capture and foreign interest capture of media. In South Africa, for example, been a huge influx of Chinese money over the last 10 years, the same in other places. So I think, the reason why state capture is happening is for two reasons, I think. A is because, autocrats have realized that media is actually a really cheap asset when it comes to controlling political influence. And that's because media isn't valued particularly highly because it's not profitable. And then the second is because there isn't independent money that's able, unless you have a benevolent billionaire, there isn't independent money able to support editorial independence. So we're actually trying to solve both of those problems. On the latter, it's fairly obvious we're putting money in, and we're trying to protect from hostile takeovers. In terms of the business model of journalism, I disagree with you a little bit, Jyoti, in terms of, you said earlier, we kind of know how to do it.
Right.
I think we can do a lot better, especially there's many places in which there hasn't been investment in tech in journalism, there hasn't been investment in diversifying newsrooms, so there's more women, there's more young people in newsrooms, and we can actually make audience engagement a lot more, we can invest a lot more ensuring that people are reading the news and valuing it, and in some places willing to pay for it, or that the business model for news is improving. For example, one of our grantees, Daraj in Lebanon, they produce investigative journalism in Lebanon, and what they've started doing is writing scripts based on their stories and selling them to streaming platforms. Now, that's not everyone's cup of tea, in terms not every journalist wants to spend their time doing that, but it's a really important source of revenue for them, and they're able to use our grants to experiment with it. And maybe the job description of journalism is changing in some places, and you need to diversify your revenue streams so that you're less immune, or you're less dependent on external capital, even whether it's benevolent or whether it's from state capture.
That's a great point. I think Lauren, you have a question?
Hi, sorry, I wasn't sure if there was a mic being passed.
There, right. Yeah.
Oops. I can talk loud, but hi. So one of the most common counter arguments when it comes to democratic philanthropy is the idea that money is inherently giving people a voice, right? So therefore, if you have money, you have more of a voice than others, and it brings up these questions of how democratic can democratic philanthropy be? So if, let's say, someone runs an organization that is pro-democracy, how can they keep that in mind when receiving these philanthropic funds? What strategies can they take to preserve their values of equal voices?
That's a great question. Is that something that comes up as you're advising donors, Stefanos, or
again, there is not one piece of advice or answer. There are different elements. So I think embodying democracy at an organizational level is important, and it can show up in many different ways. So I would mention, first of all, engage with this conversation, as we've seen many foundations doing. Not engaging with this conversation is not an option, and finding thoughtful, meaningful answers. I would talk about transparency and governance. We see foundations asking for nominations and applications in terms of having their communities and grantees and constituents represented further upstream where decisions are being made. We see a movement towards participatory grant making and practices, so decisions are made by the people that have most direct experience with certain issues and face the flames. Again, there's a whole set of practices in terms of deep listening to grantee partners, in terms of aligning assets and ways of working with the mission. So there are a lot of different things that foundations can do to engage constructively with this tension and not have them in a deterministically way, undermining democracy, because again, foundations are part of civil society and have a critical role to play in strengthening democracy in the civic space.
Yeah. Okay, I see a hand raised in the back there. Can you stand up and then the mic will come to you? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Khaldun. I feel very inspired by your talk. And I just want to comment on a topic that came to my mind while talking to Nishant yesterday. I come from the heart of Europe, from Germany, and from a specific place, East Germany. And I am very happy that I got to meet my parents, both of them, because the dictatorship of the GDR collapsed. And so democracy is very close to my heart. And what I realized is a certain gap when it comes to philanthropy with regards to Germany. As Germany is seen as a developed economy, we do not see the difference between the former GDR, a former communist system, and the fact that only 7.4% of all foundations in Germany are actually situated in the East. And now we currently have the situation that 30% of votes in a lot of states during the elections got to right-wing extremist parties. And what we see right now is an attempt also by, let's say, West German foundations to support structures in the East. And I think that's a good thing, and they should look for people that know the structures there, know how the culture, also the democratic culture, developed there. And I just want to emphasize that Germany plays an important role not only in the future of democracy, but also in the future of Europe. And I just want to sensitize everyone that it is also important to invest there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think if there's a question there, I think it's something really about the importance of that awareness of domestic philanthropy, even as we're talking about the global issue of democracy. Is that something one of you would like to address? Stefanos, his question was about Europe, so I'll throw this one to you.
I can't talk about their German funders in the room, so perhaps a discussion can continue, but maybe on the importance of creating infrastructure and domestic funding scenes. We've seen that in places as diverse as India or Georgia, what happens, how easily the closing space for civil society can have an impact on the operating environment. So one lesson maybe and one advice is for funders, again, as part also linked to what Nishant said about localization and working close to the ground, is helping support and strengthen strong domestic funding scenes that when crisis comes and the civic space might be further constrained, there are actors that can continue the work.
Okay.
So,
yeah, and there's just two things I'm taking away from that comment. One, I think, is it's always important to think about philanthropically underserved areas within one's geographic area of focus. And like in the United States, for example, the American South has some of the most anti-democratic practices in the country, but because a lot of those states are less relevant in elections, and have less resources to begin with, they're very philanthropically underserved. And then second, this is why it's so critical for us to do this international comparing of notes, because we really need a broad coalition of folks who are working on this in different contexts, because the fate of Germany is intertwined with the fate of the United States, with the fate of other countries, and we just really need to be thinking across boundaries in that way.
Okay, it's a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Jyoti.